Adamsen, founder and executive director of the Talent Strategy Institute. I'm here today with a longtime friend and colleague, Stefan Gaertner. I've had the good pleasure of knowing Stefan for a little over 10 years now, probably. So Stefan was formerly a lead analyst at Adamsen, and now he's a principal here at Mercer, leading the Western U.S.'s workforce analytics function. And we're going to discuss what is key in getting workforce analytics started in your organization, because obviously you've been at this, what, 10, 15 plus years now. Mm-hmm. So obviously has a lot of insight into this area, and you hold a doctorate as well. Can you tell us about that? What's your doctorate in?
A doctorate in human resources, yeah.
So that's pretty applicable. Actually, as I recall, your research back at, I believe it was a conference in Scottsdale, Arizona, I had seen things that I had not seen before, and I always regarded you as an innovator. So given our discussion today, what are the key things that you have seen being commonplace among those organizations that have actually been able to create an ongoing sustainable workforce analytics capability?
Yeah, I mean, there are many points. If I should just summarize a few, I would say the first one is that organizations who are successful, they basically start with a vision. They don't dive into technology and structure first. They basically start thinking about what exactly do they want to get out of this analytics thing. Right. So the second thing that they do is they really work towards that vision. Mm-hmm. They're not saying we have to walk before we run, or we have to take baby steps towards a goal. They're not hiring the most junior analyst they can get to start on this journey. They basically understand what their vision is, and then consistently with the vision, staff and build technology. Mm-hmm. The third thing that they do right is they not just develop the vision together with the business, but they also become a part of the business. Mm-hmm. Analytics would then not just do their own thing or develop their own scorecards and send them out. Right. It's then more about listening to the business on an ongoing basis, trying to find out what the issues are, and then strategically and focused deploy the metrics and analytics in the right way to answer these questions. Sure. The other thing that they do right is they don't try to work against an HR culture. They try to, as much as possible, work with the HR culture, which sometimes is very interesting and difficult to do. I noticed that generalists, HR business partners, they have often a very micro kind of view when it comes to people. They care about Mike and Julie and Joe, and analytics is more on the macro side. Sure. So the best organizations are able to overcome this and basically blend the macro with the micro into good stories to tell. Well said. And then finally, I think the other big thing that they do is that they don't start to think about analytics as being a revolution that changes everything, but they're thinking about analytics as something that supports the business in a better way. Sure. So they're basically not saying, now I have the data and you should listen to me. Yeah. They're basically saying, now we are using the data to support you making the right decisions. Understanding that just because you have data now, decisions will not always go your way. Right. And I think that's perfectly all right.
That's absolutely all right. So I'm hearing a very pragmatic approach that's grounded in a vision and a roadmap to achieve it. Is that fair to say?
It's fair to say, yes.
And I couldn't agree more. I had a conversation recently with a colleague in Australia, and he said, Al, gosh, this workforce planning analytics stuff sounds great, but I don't think as a discipline we've done a really good job of painting a picture of what that finished product is going to look like. He drew the analogy of, hey, gosh, that building, what's that bright, shiny building? So an architect doesn't come in and sell the foundation and pilings and the frame. They sell the end product and the benefits it will bring. Obviously, creating a workforce analytics deliverable and standing up a center of excellence, if you will, is not as linear as building a building. But at the same time, what I'm hearing, going back to your first question, is that leaders have to crystallize a vision for what they want workforce analytics to deliver.
Yes.
Is that fair to say? And if so, how does a vision get created? How have you seen it be created?
So a vision gets created when I think the HR functions actually seeks to build one.
Mm.
And that sounds pretty mundane, but it is really also quite powerful. So what that means is I have rarely ever seen the business, so business being a very broad term, coming out and saying, you over there, accountant, give me a vision for what finance should look like.
Right.
Or you over there, IT guy, show me what your grander vision for using information technology would be like in your organization.
Right.
So the vision would have to come from HR. And that basically means that somebody in HR has to say, look, here is what the business needs through my lens. Now let's start to think about how we best fulfill what the business wants from us.
Sure.
And I would tell you that the moment you start strategically like that, when you start thinking about linking the business and talent towards success, you end up talking about data very quickly.
Sure.
And that's what I mean. I mean, at that point, you sit down, you start, as an HR person, start to map out that road that you want to travel on. We did something like this just very recently with a large hospital chain in North America. And the issue that they faced at the beginning before we came was what most organizations do face. They have lots of different people who do analytics within their islands.
Yeah.
They have a scorecard that nobody uses. And for us to get together within that group to talk about where they are, to talk about what potential visions are there, and then to build a roadmap was extremely powerful. And it wasn't a 100-page document that came out of that.
Yeah.
It was basically an understanding of that we, as HR, with the business, where do we want to be, and what would be everybody's role.
Sure.
I think the first thing that we said and the last thing that we said during that meeting, when we talked about that blueprint, when we finalized it, was, you know, at the end of the day, what you're doing is important, but it's probably not as important as the mere fact that you're doing it together towards a single vision.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And what I heard embedded in that is that ultimately creating this vision and commanding resources to actually fulfill that vision is rooted in an HR leader's decision to say, this is what we're going to do.
Yes.
As opposed to saying, hey, I know exactly what I'm going to do, that there's a value proposition that's embedded in what they want and what the business leaders want. And they now are leaving room to create along the way. Yeah. So it's not, again, to use my word from earlier, linear. So tell me a little bit more about points 2 and 3 that you made, developing this roadmap, engaging the broader HR community so they're having better, more meaningful discussions with the business. How does that create, how does that manifest, how does that come into reality?
So when you start working towards the roadmap, what I've noticing happening very often that HR starts that journey a little bit too timid, saying that we don't really want to make a lot of investments and we don't really have the budget to hire somebody who really knows this stuff very well.
Right.
And if you start that journey that way, that basically reveals to me either that you don't really have a vision, or that whatever vision you have is not aligned with what the business needs.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would add that they're not looking at it that they've spent in large organizations many millions of dollars on talent-related technologies that house data. That's an asset of their organization that if it's not utilized to tell stories, then it's marginalized, right?
Yeah.
So please.
So yeah, and I would add to that once you take these expenses into account, how expensive it is to get an HRIS systems up.
Yeah.
It's really just a fraction of that
Right.
to really turn the data now into something useful for the organization.
Absolutely.
So this timidness, which I hear a lot, you have to walk before the run, before you run, or you have to crawl before you walk.
Right.
And we are not there yet.
Mm-hmm.
This is probably not the right way to start. Honestly, if you think you're not there yet, then you probably shouldn't start at all.
Right.
So the idea now is, if you have a vision, you should have the confidence to really do what you need to do to get this vision going.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those are the best examples that I have seen. And we're not talking about a multi-million-dollar infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
What we're talking about is a useful infrastructure that you can apply to, in a scalable way,
mm-hmm.
to turn data into information.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe 1, 2, 3 good people with some experience who can actually start telling story with data and turn the needle. That would, in many cases, that would actually be enough to get a vision going.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you need to support these guys accordingly.
Well, tell me more about that, if you would, or tell the audience more about that. I often say that what's lacking is leader decisions to really make this a priority, create the vision, and 2, really resource people properly. In other words, so they have a focus on doing analytics or planning, whatever the mandate is.
Mm-hmm.
Because, let me know if you agree or not, many analysts are really report generators, and they're instructed, well, analyze this, tell me the story. So it becomes a part-time job.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, at least in my experience, reporting becomes the priority.
Yeah.
So they rarely ever get to the analysis, and if they do, they're staying up till 11, 12 at night over the course of weeks to put together a deliverable and creating this artificial capacity. So would you agree with the assertion that for analytics to be stood up in a very capable, sustainable way, there needs to be professional analysts focused on doing analytics?
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure of that.
Yeah.
And what I've to add on to that, I think the very reason why so many of the HR analytics roles or part-time roles turn into reporting roles is exactly that.
Mm.
If you don't have a dedicated resource, the organization will fall back into a place that feels convenient.
Right.
And that is the place.
Mm.
And in fact, to many HR practitioners, that's the place as well, which is to be not proactive, but to be reactive.
Yep.
To follow the business, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the business, they may not have that broader vision around workforce analytics.
Mm-hmm.
That means business case and support the strategy of the business through advanced analytics. The business, they often, to them, often HR is sort of the last resort, the remaining piece
Mm-hmm.
after they took care of everything else.
Mm-hmm.
So when they get to it, they probably pick up the phone and says, all right, I have a little time on my hand, I want to understand turnover better. Or
Right.
Michael over there left and a few others left as well, so I have to basically understand what the idea is with turnover.
Yeah.
And then they just call up, they're happy. They're happy just having somebody who runs their reports.
Right.
And on their own, they probably don't really expect anything else.
Mm-hmm.
But here is, I think, the difference between strategy and tactic or administration. For HR, really take these opportunities seriously.
Yep.
And go and talk to the business leader and says, you want to turnover data? Here it is.
Yep.
And here's what it means.
Sure.
And here's what we can do about it.
Yeah.
I have a really nice case that I came across, which was when I was outside of HR working in business analytics forecasting.
Mm-hmm.
So when I saw HR sort of through the eyes of a customer, and within our group we had an employee turnover issue.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, we wanted to understand outside of HR what the root causes was of the turnover issue. And the business works with data. So We designed a survey. We administered the survey. We evaluated the survey.
Mm-hmm.
We did, not HR did.
Mm-hmm.
And the HR business partner's only role was basically to show up at the presentation meeting, to introduce the topic,
Wow.
and then to take questions. And in fact, the most difficult questions she passed on to the business.
Right.
And I think to me, this was eye-opening in that it really reveals to me what the difference is between tactic
Mm-hmm.
and personal administration, which is kind of the comfort zone of HR.
Sure.
Just follow the business, do what they ask you to do, and you won't get in trouble.
Right.
Or the opportunity there to basically take control of that and says, you have a turnover problem, we design the survey for you.
Mm-hmm.
Or we work with you to design the survey. We analyze and interpret the data.
Right.
We have you review our recommendations.
And that would go under the assumption that the HR organization has been resourced properly, budget-wise, and they have an analyst on staff with the capability to do that work. And unfortunately, correct me if I'm wrong, many companies have not commissioned such an analyst to really focus to do that work. But therein lies the value proposition. What I'm also hearing in that is if HR doesn't do it, somebody else within the organization might do it. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, but it's also the difference between what you would call a vicious circle or a virtuous circle. If you kind of continue to be on the defensive,
Mm-hmm.
People will see less and less of the value that you could create.
Mm-hmm.
And I think HR has been on the defensive for a long time.
Yeah. Oh, 100%.
I mean, you just have to look at the stats. HR functions have been on the decline. And I think that's the reason.
Mm-hmm.
We're playing it safe. Happy to keep our job that way.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's not everybody is that way, but I think this is sort of the dominating response
Yeah.
in HR to play it safe.
Well, you just touched on this because HR has been on the defensive, and one of the reasons, in my view, particularly around analytics, is they've historically been the customers of the data. In other words, analysts have been challenged with making magic, making these stories appear out of existing data. They being HR, has not gotten ahead of the strategy and say, what are we measuring in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
And how are we then going to have that inform the stories that the business wants to hear? So when you have, let's say, an organization that's creating this vision,
Mm-hmm.
are you seeing them tackle the challenge of formulating a measurement strategy for talent? Can you speak to that a little bit? Like what do you measure in the first place?
Yeah, that would be definitely part of that vision.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately what the business needs from HR
Mm-hmm.
when it comes to analytics. And I think what they need from HR is answers to difficult questions.
Yeah.
And to the extent that you can provide data to answer these difficult questions, you will really show up as somebody who leads the business from a human capital side,
Mm-hmm.
and as somebody who really makes a difference.
Yeah.
Here's another example. When we start thinking about data, and what I hear a lot, to your point, is, can you answer that question? Answer back from HR, no, we don't have the data.
Yeah.
And that is a really strange way to look at that.
Sure.
Because ultimately, maybe you don't have that data at this moment, but the business is asking for something, so your answer should be, we don't have the data yet,
Yep.
but we are working on something.
Absolutely.
And some really strange things are happening that we take for granted. For example, I mean, could ask you what are the key factors that organizations pay for, and the answer probably would be somewhere around education and experience.
Yeah.
And I actually have the data to show that. And how many organizations really have good data on experience, prior experience in education? Not
much,
many.
no.
But they pay millions and millions, large organizations, billions and billions on dollar for education and experience. They don't know how much they pay. They don't know if it's really worthwhile.
Sure.
So, and I think that's part of the same thinking. It's sort of saying, somebody asks HR, what are we paying for? And HR would answer, yeah, well, we pay for tenure, but we can't tell you anything about experience and education because we don't have that data.
Yeah, we haven't measured it probably, haven't thought about it beforehand, right?
Yeah.
So you've touched on this a couple times because analytics have done well and truly going to tell a story about what's going on with talent, not only inside the organization but outside. Truly addresses data that's embedded within the organization as well as in the broader talent market. Is that fair to say from your experience that it's both internal data as well as external data?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Bringing that together. So with that in mind, if you're going to create a vision with your clients, you've mentioned the head of HR, you've mentioned the business, you've touched on HRIS. In translating a little bit, you also touched on talent management. Who else should be at the table there, formulating this vision for what analytics should look like?
Yeah, finance for sure.
Yeah.
And I would highlight the business partner, HR business partner, as an important person as well,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is the most interesting or pivotal role when it comes to it.
Mm-hmm.
Because the business partners are the ones who really maintain the relationship.
Yep.
One reason I think why HR analytics or workforce analytics has such a hard time is because it is still very difficult to make the connection between business partners and analytics.
Sure.
And I mean, if you remember earlier, that was sort of my third point,
Mm-hmm.
to do a better job on both sides, on the business partner side, to better understand analytics,
Mm-hmm.
and for analytics people to better understand the business partners.
Right.
I hear so much complaining about that on the analytics side, and also on the business partner side, actually.
So they don't just get it.
Because,
I want data, they don't have it. And all that.
Yeah, and they don't, and it's really difficult though. I mean, on the analytics side, you talk about rates, generalizations, the big picture.
Mm-hmm.
And business partners, for the most part, at least when they are sort of frontline business partners, it's probably a little bit different when they move further up the hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
But frontline business partners, they talk more in terms of Jill, Joe, Jack, Gina. So they talk about more individuals.
Mm-hmm.
So if the analyst comes over and says, turnover is high, then the business partner's initial response is, well, but Mike is still here, and
Right.
Jude is also not here.
Yeah.
They may remember some exit interviews, they may not be. So it's sort of a different perspective altogether, sort of the individual focus to the
More broad
aggregate focus.
Right.
So there's really some need to tell a story together and get them involved, because ultimately business partners would be a very powerful ally.
So if the business partner is engaging, say, an HR generalist, they'll want to know what the future holds or what's likely going to happen, and where's my talent going to come from. And obviously some talent can come from inside the organization, other talent might come from outside the organization. So I'm hearing that, going back to that visioning group, or call it a governance body for lack of a better term, it would be everything learning and development, creating a pipeline of talent internally, talent acquisition likely, as well as finance, operations, HR.
Well, the vision is a real strategic vision.
Yeah, so
and
throughout the employee life
strategy
cycle,
for HR doesn't just mean to be linked up to the business.
Yeah.
It also means to define something that is applies to the whole HR function.
Sure.
Not a recruitment strategy, not a learning and development strategy, but basically a human capital strategy.
So the overarching that would involve comp and everything that we just touched on, yeah?
And then, and that's also the moment when you know as an HR function, not only that you are successful with analytics, but also that you have turned strategic in a very comprehensive way.
Yeah, absolutely. So given everything that you're sharing, I mean, if someone is, had some start and stops over their career, and in this organization, they've actually voiced, oh, we're not there yet. So what has to change in that dialogue? What has to be that seminal event to say, okay, now we're going to go? Is it convening this body that's actually going to put together the vision? Is that the event that has to take place?
That's a possibility. I mean, we're talking about now an organization that's sort of already in the middle of it. They probably already have made some adjustments or investments. They have their analysts sitting there, and the analysts now maybe for 2, 3, maybe even 5 or 10 years have been doing reports.
Right.
And now it's the HR person saying, that's not enough.
Yeah.
So I think the one way is really exactly to say, let's go to the vision. Yeah. And I would say, if change here comes from the top, from the head of HR, that's the way to go.
Yeah.
The other thing is, though, and that makes it a bit tricky, because I want to talk a little bit about those people who are not at the top, who are basically maybe now managing a workforce analytics group, and want to make a change as well. They can't just go out and put all of the people together in one room.
Right, sure.
It's very difficult.
Right.
So obviously they should try to talk to the head of HR and see if they get something like this going.
Yeah.
But if that's not the case, the other thing is, well, two very related methodologies. The first one is to basically start listening to the business itself. I wouldn't recommend to go beyond go over business partners as you do that, but occasionally it has been done, even successfully. But either way, you want to start listening to the business itself, trying to figure out what are the issues they're talking about on the human capital side.
Yep.
So that issue that I mentioned when I was on the business side, that's a good example. There's a turnover rate that's going up. They're worried about that.
Yeah, imminent retirement risk and all that combined. Yeah.
Retirement risks, or it could be anything. There could be buy versus build. One organization said we hire so many people and they're not doing well. Can we now focus more on internal talent? Or another one says, I think we as an organization became more top heavy. What can we do about that?
Yeah.
So try to find an issue. So try to find a nail and then use your hammer. Right? So try to find an issue and then work towards it and use this as some sort of a pilot project.
Sure.
Something to talk about, and then tell the story throughout. So and the related one is, well, you can use the data that you already have and try to start to engage people on conversations around that. That's another way you can do. I mean, both approaches are a little bit more on the bottom-up side. I feel, or my experience is that deploying metrics to existing business issues is a lot easier than trying to tell stories with data and then hope that somebody has a fitting business issue for that.
Yeah, 100%.
You don't have to do as much convincing. You're basically right in the middle of that.
So to summarize that, if I heard that correctly, if there is a critical issue that has a lot of attention within a particular organization, particularly among executives, especially that operational leader and head of HR, if they deliver on that, then that would effectively create a business case to create more capability underneath that so they can create more such stories.
Yeah.
And based on your experience, correct me if I'm wrong, it's related to what has challenged me in the past is once you embark, it's not guaranteed that you're going to be able to tell that beautiful story because there's going to be gaps in the data and it would be, oh gosh, it would be really nice if we had captured this, 2-3 years ago, or it'd be really nice if we go after this, but it's going to cost X. So it actually identifies the data that we now need to tell that story that leaders want to tell. Is that
that's true? Yeah. So the state of despair that you often encounter makes little sense to me. So that people say we don't have the data and they throw up their arms and saying this is the end of the journey. Yeah. So step one is to go back and see where the data can be found.
Yeah.
But here's another step to that. And that's something that I learned from finance and that I learned from marketing analytics. If you don't have data, you make assumptions. And if those assumptions are not the right ones, you talk with your clients and say, okay, we don't have the data. So what is the better assumption to make?
Yeah.
You can develop scenarios, you can start developing ranges. So there's a lot of things you can do even if you don't have the data.
Well, tell our audience about that because not many people listening are likely PhDs in an analytical discipline like you are. And there's this constant pursuit for certainty. A plus B equals C, therefore we should do A, and therefore then C will happen because B is in place. And that linearity, as well as I, does not exist in these open systems that we're analyzing. It's not a realistic expectation. So tell me about probabilities and probabilistic decision making and what you're alluding to now.
So I think that goes back to the fifth point that I made. Don't approach this with a revolutionary mindset. Just because you have data doesn't mean you move all the way from a practitioner to a scientist within a few weeks or years.
Right.
In fact, it is quite eye-opening to understand how data and analytics works outside of HR, where this is already a lot more normal. So you sit down, clarify, illuminate, support a subject that people are already talking about using some data. And then you can start weaving stories together with data points and assumptions. But what's important is you're very clear as to what these assumptions are. You're very clear as to what is or is not available in the data.
Right.
And then you weave this uncertainty into your story, if you will take it, use it to your advantage in a way that makes this whole thing a lot less threatening than before.
Yeah.
It's not about just, now they have the data, you do what I tell you to do.
Right.
It's really about, look, you have this issue, you probably heard a lot of anecdotal evidence from all sorts of people. So I took a look at the data, and here's the story that I'm telling you. A very mundane example. If you find out, for example, that something that you do or don't do has an impact on employee performance, and you have the stats and the data to demonstrate that, say, internal talent is more likely to be among the top performers. You cannot quantify performance ratings, but you can make a few assumptions to set a range and say, we as an organization, we believe that performance is important. We can't measure it directly, but according to our supervisor, Mike and his fellow promotees are better performers than Joe and his fellow hirees. So let's just think about how we can turn this into some sort of a dollar estimate. And if you will, put a range around that.
Right.
Finance likes that stuff, and I tell you, finance does this stuff all the time.
All the time.
And some of the assumptions that they make, they really are quite remarkable.
And they adjust their books. They say, hey, we were wrong, and they learn. And that's where I think, correct me if I'm wrong, HR needs to open up, be vulnerable, and make some mistakes. You know, hey, they're not going to have 100% confidence that this is right, but they're going to advance the thinking of their internal customer, namely the operations or the business partner. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the vision and the buy-in, where it really comes in handy from the start.
So,
if you do that journey together, you are more allowed to make mistakes down the road. But I wouldn't say that a wrong assumption is a mistake.
Right.
It never is.
So just to summarize, I sense that the goal is really to elevate confidence and not achieve certainty. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Fair way to summarize it?
Certainty is not the goal that you would strive. I mean, certainty in the real world just doesn't exist.
Yeah, 100% agree.
And that's probably where I think, philosophically at least, people who do analytics first get a little bit too far when they think about it. And I think it would make it a lot easier for them to get started if they are approaching this topic a little bit more, sober.
Yeah, sure. Pragmatically and realistically. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, as we wrap up here, are there any other points that you'd like to emphasize that you haven't touched on yet, or that you have and you just want to drive it home, particularly under the theme of, hey, we're starting this off, or we're really looking forward to taking the next step? We're hearing vision, we're hearing roadmap, we're hearing engaging HR business partners. How can you summarize?
Yeah, I think just at the end of the day, we should keep our eyesight on what we're trying to accomplish with workforce analytics. And I have done this for 15 years, a little longer, and before that I was an academic, looking at relationships between human capital and business performance. And I mean, maybe just a couple of cases to just say the money that's on the table is real. Yeah. There's a case with an organization. It was not really high-end statistics that were put to the plate, where you just started to monitor their structure over time, seeing that the way how they hired, promoted, and terminated employees inadvertently over years, ever so slowly, barely noticeable, but noticeable when you look at the data, made them more top-heavy, which added annually, was a big organization, about $100 million in cost, without a mandate from anyone
Wow.
to say we need to achieve that. It just happened.
Right. Wow.
And it happened over many years. So that's one case. Or another case that I briefly alluded to, an organization that basically learned that promoting more people internally creates a workforce that stays longer, performs better, and is cheaper at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Also at a price tag about $40–50 million a year.
Wow.
Just think about the dimensions here.
Mm-hmm.
This is more than most of the organizations would spend on the entire HR staff.
Yeah. Wow.
Let alone the budget for things beyond wages. So there's a lot of money on the table. That's why you want to do this ultimately.
Yeah.
And I think that organizations who don't do it and don't do it right are just really leaving that opportunity on the table.
And incurring undue risk, I'm hearing as well, yeah?
At the same time,
Yeah.
yes.
Wow. Well, thank you for spending time. Always great to listen to you and learn with you. I super appreciate you sharing today. And I hope everybody understood Stefan's Tennessee accent clearly. Where are you from originally?
From Germany originally.
What part?
Yeah, the north, near Hamburg.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, super smart, super well educated, and I super, again, appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Nice talking to you.